I'm Alex and this is Technical. Now, by the very nature of this video, it's going to be very complex and in-depth. If you're looking for some explanations and just my recommended settings like the TLDW of this video per se, check the description. Everything will be typed out there and you can look at that and maybe get a good understanding of my recommended settings. That said, if you want an actual understanding, if you want to know the nuts and bolts of OBS and why I'm recommending the things I'm recommending, stick around for the rest of the video because I'm going to go in depth with everything. And I really don't see how someone new to OBS could walk away from this video without a better understanding of how the application actually works. And then they can understand the settings I'm recommending better and make better decisions for their settings. So, sorry I bumped the microphone, but I'm doing it live, baby. Let's talk about OBS's recording settings. Now, obviously, this is just about recording settings. I'm not going to talk about streaming in this video. If you want that video, be sure to subscribe, turn on notifications because I'm making that video in the near future. But now let's talk about recording with OBS. Base canvas resolution. The first thing you should worry about is your video resolution in OBS. Native resolution is the key. You want to be recording at whatever resolution your game is running at. So if you're playing in 1080p, record in 1080p. And the reason for this is if you record at something lower, you're throwing away all the resolution between 1080p and whatever you set it to that's lower. And that's resolution you could use in editing to do crops and push and pull and all kinds of stuff that will give you a little bit better quality than if you had, recorded at 720p when you were playing at 1080p. So native resolution. Again, in the description will be sort of an explanation of why you don't need a super powerful GPU to record at 4K or whatever. But most modern CPUs and GPUs should be able to handle 1080p 60 FPS and even up to 4K 60 FPS because there's dedicated hardware on your GPU handling the encoding. That encoder, at least on Nvidia GPUs across the Turing architecture, is the same. And they can all handle 4K 60 FPS and probably more than that. So they're not the limiting factor. The limiting factor is utilization across your GPU and CPU by the game itself. That's the resolution recommendation I'm going to make here. That said, frame rate is not so cut and dry. You can actually match the frame rate to the content you're recording. So if your gameplay is 30 FPS, like you're playing a console game, you can set OBS to 30 FPS and you'll be fine. You shouldn't have a little guy in your shoulder going,
hey man, you should record at 60 because that's what gamers do.
That's not how it works. You can feel free to match your recording FPS to your gameplay FPS. That said, there's going to be a time where you meant to be recording at 60 FPS, but you recorded at 30, and now your recording looks like doo-doo because you were playing a 60 FPS game. My recommendation is leave this at 60 FPS because when you set it to 60 FPS, even 30 FPS content will look okay. It should look perfectly normal. That said, if you need like frame accurate recordings of a game, you need to be matching your frame rate to that because there can be like frame doubling or something weird going on. I'm not the master of frame rate stuff. All I know is, and my recommendation is, match your frame rate if you want, but you don't have to, and you can just set it to 60 and forget it. It shouldn't be a problem. Now let's talk about the output tab. Again, streaming stuff, subscribe, turn on notifications. I'll make a tutorial about that in the future. Let's get into recording. Now, unfortunately, I do have to start this part off with a bit of a barrier to entry conversation. That is buying an SSD. If you're recording to a mechanical hard drive and not experiencing frame drops, Papa bless you because you're doing something magical and I want to know about it. In my experience, a mechanical hard drive will be the bottleneck between you getting a stable recording and not getting a stable recording with OBS. And that's simply because the read and write speed of mechanical hard drives isn't fast enough to keep up with the demand of a high quality video recording like what we're going to be doing here. And really, you don't want to go lower in quality than what I'm recommending because then you're throwing away quality for no reason. And these settings, believe it or not, are actually optimized for performance and quality. So go out, spend 50 or 60 bucks on a nice SSD that's like 500 gigs or 250 gigs, and you will be good to go as that is set up as your recording drive. Most SSDs, even the cheap ones, are fast enough to keep up with the demands of OBS, unless you're doing something crazy like recording 1 gigabit a second files or something. I don't know, but most people don't do that. Most people can't do that even if they have an SSD, so don't worry about it. Just buy a cheap SSD and you'll be good to go. Don't buy something that fell off a truck, obviously, but if it's from a reputable brand like SanDisk, Kingston, AData, WD, whatever, it should be more than enough. You don't need a super fancy M.2 drive that costs $1,000 and only has 100 gigabytes of storage space. You just don't. Recording format. Now, there are two options here that most people consider, MP4 and MKV. The other ones, they're kind of like, edge case things that you can use, but you shouldn't. MP4s are what most people use because they're widely compatible with like everything. Everything seems to play back MP4s just fine. That said, there's a problem with MP4 files, and that is they need a little bit of extra data to be written at the end of the file when recording finishes. So if OBS crashes before you hit stop recording, your MP4 file is probably going to be trashed. That said, there is a better option, and that is MKV files. Now, MKV files are more like a constant stream of audio and video data. There's no quality difference, and there's no performance impact difference. The big difference is redundancy and safety against crashes. So if OBS crashes while you're recording an MKV file, it should be fine. There are obviously situations where it won't be fine, especially if your computer like blue screens or something while you're recording. But by and large, MKV files are much more resilient to crashes and are much less prone to being corrupted by crashes. The caveat with MKV files is they need to be remuxed to MP4s to work in Premiere Pro. The good news is, of course, OBS has a manual remuxing tool that you can just drag and drop your files into. It creates an MP4 file in about as much time as it would take to duplicate the file, and that's really quick and straightforward and simple, and OBS can also be set up to do that automatically. You just check this box in the advanced settings and bada bing, bada boom, every MKV file you create becomes an MP4 file. And just keep in mind, you have to delete the MKV file if you want to not have duplicate files of everything, but there's no codependency. Like, you don't need the MKV file still to make the MP4 file work. They're completely separate, unique files. They're just duplicates of each other, and you can throw away the MKV files as soon as you're done remuxing. I do it manually because I don't need every file I record to edit with, but for those that I do, I just manually remux them and I'm good to go. Next, we get to the audio tracks, and this is really straightforward. If you're using OBS and you have multiple audio devices, you should have them set to individual tracks so you can edit them individually in post-production. And then if your recording settings don't have the audio tracks selected, you're not gonna get audio in your file. So make sure you do that. It's straightforward. Select the audio tracks that you're recording audio to. It's that simple. Encoder. If you look in the description, you're going to see a big block of text that talks about encoder and GPU, purchasing advice, all this crazy stuff. In a nutshell, Nvidia NVENC H.264 parentheses new is the encoder you should be using. You should have an Nvidia GPU to use OBS with. That's not a hard and fast rule. AMD GPU support is available in OBS and it is good, but NVENC New is the fastest and most efficient way to record with OBS, short of using something like Shadowplay, which is NVIDIA's own recording software built into GeForce Experience. And the reason for this is because OBS and NVIDIA work really closely together to develop NVENC New. It's a new software implementation that talks to the hardware on your GPU and encodes video. The old version, while it's still good and usable, is a much more roundabout, inefficient, and slower version of the NVENC software implementation. And I highly recommend you use the new one. It's just faster, it's more efficient, and there is no quality difference. The quality difference comes in the actual GPU hardware, and across all of the Turing GPUs, there is the exact same NVENC encoder chip. So they all have exactly the same amount of visual quality and performance. The difference is like VRAM and stuff can limit you in editing and all sorts of other things, but really you shouldn't have to worry about it, especially with OBS. If you have a normal 6 gig 2060 or whatever, you have the exact same potential for recording as a 2080 Ti. That said, there are some things you can do if you aren't able to record in OBS with your current GPU. Like if you have a 2060 and OBS, the frame rate just keeps tanking for no apparent reason. The problem with recording with OBS, and this is just true in general of whether or not you have an AMD or an Nvidia GPU, if your game is running at 100% GPU utilization, OBS will not get the resources it needs to maintain a stable frame rate because the game is hogging up the GPU entirely. It's hogging up all of the buses, all of the GPU cores, and it's basically saying, GPU mine, you no have. You need to keep your utilization between like 90 and 80%. That's like the sweet spot for being able to record with OBS. And the way you can do this, there's a lot of ways. You can buy a really expensive GPU and throw more horsepower at the problem, or you can limit your in-game FPS to your monitor's refresh rate, which is probably going to be 60 FPS. And if your game is running at 120 FPS and you're using 100% of your GPU, limiting it to 60 or something lower than that, it's going to lower your usage dramatically. Likewise, if you don't want to limit your FPS, you can turn down quality settings in-game. So you can go from the ultra preset to the high preset and probably claw back a ton of performance at basically no cost to visual quality. And of course, there's always the elephant in the room, resolution. You can lower your in-game resolution to a lower value, and that will claw back a lot of GPU usage resources. But you might not want to do that one, and that's the one where, like, if you've done everything else, you've limited FPS, you've turned down settings, and you're still struggling to get below 90 or 80% utilization, that's where you would want to go spend more money on a better GPU. You might also be CPU limited, so keep in mind that if your CPU is running at like 100% all the time, but your GPU is only hitting like 50, 60, 75% load, your CPU bottlenecked and you should upgrade your CPU. That said, this is not like a buying advice guide. I'm not telling you to go out and buy a more expensive GPU. Like I've already said, the hardware encoder built into all of the Turing-based NVIDIA GPUs is exactly the same. They can all handle 4K, so that's not the problem. The problem is the actual utilization of the GPU cores by the game itself. So like I said, there's a bunch of things you can do to limit it. And in terms of visual quality, the hardware difference is where things come into play between Turing and prior generations of NVIDIA GPUs. Basically, NVIDIA was like, all right, we got to make the NVENC encoder really good for Turing. We got to make it improved. And so the actual hardware was improved, which yields better visual quality than prior generations. The software implementation of NVENC and OBS has no bearing on the visual quality. It's not a limiting factor at all. It's all about speed and efficiency. So NVENC New is the recommendation. There is going to be a lot more explanation in the description if you need it. Let's continue to rate control. Now, a lot of people probably use CBR, and that's great if you want to predefine the file size per second. 50,000 kilobits per second is, I'm pretty sure, 50 megabytes a second of bandwidth. So basically every second of video is going to be 50 megabytes. And that's great if you're like, all right, I got this much space, I need this much time recorded, how big is it going to be? The problem with this is that you've predefined the bitrate for every frame. So if a particular frame needs more bitrate, like it's really visually complex and it needs 70,000 kilobits per second, it's not going to get it, and the end result is going to be artifacting your video. That's where you get all that weird blocking and stuff, and that's poo-poo, and we don't want that. Likewise, a static scene like what you're watching right now doesn't need 50,000 kilobits per second. It needs like 12,000 maybe. And in this situation, you're still throwing 50,000 kilobits per second at something that needs a quarter of that, and you're just inflating your file sizes. So the better alternative is CQP. And basically what this does is it intelligently looks at the complexity of every individual frame of your recording and says, all right, for this frame, give it this bit rate. For this frame, give it this bit rate. And it can fluctuate, and you can set the range at which it fluctuates. For 1080p 60 FPS content, the CQ level should be between 18 and 23. You can go lower, you can go higher, but 18 is approaching lossless quality and 23 is approaching, it's okay for YouTube quality. Both are fine. I recommend 20. 20 is like a good middle ground, obviously. And to my eye, it looks pristine. You can certainly go down to 18 or even lower for 1080p content and get an even more close to lossless file. That's fine, but you really don't need to. Once you get to like 1920, you're like at the limit for what you're going to be able to appreciate visually. And especially if you're uploading it to YouTube or Twitch or something, you're just throwing away tons of quality at that point anyway. And even if you upload the raw file, YouTube's still going to compress it and make it look worse. The one thing to keep in mind is if you up the resolution, you have to lower the range of the CQ level. Basically, you have to make it go lower because you're asking for more data per second by increasing the resolution and frame rate. So 1080p 60 FPS content, 18 to 23 is the good range. You can go lower, you can go higher, obviously, but that's kind of the good range that I've found. For 1440p content or 4K content, the range might be 12 to 20 or something like that. It goes down as you up the resolution because you're saying, all right, look, this is more demanding, so it needs more bitrate. But again, 20 is a good value. Keyframe interval. leave it at 0. I've read what keyframes do 1,000 times and I literally could not tell you. It's just one of those things, it doesn't make a difference whether or not you use 0, 1, 2, whatever. I'm sure it does. I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments below, but 0 works fine. It's fine. Just use 0. Preset. Now this is one that a lot of people get hung up on. They see this max quality one. They're like, that's what I want. I want max quality. I don't want anything limiting me. The thing is, all max quality does is enable 2-pass encoding, which basically means it looks at every frame twice and decides, okay, the first time I said this much, this time on further inspection, yeah, you could throw some away, or maybe it needs a little bit more. It's really not that useful, especially considering we're using a CQ level that's appropriate for our recordings. So you can set it to quality. And the big difference between quality and max quality, aside from being enabling or disabling 2-pass encoding, is 2-pass encoding uses GPU resources, which can be the limiting factor between getting a stable recording in OBS and not getting a stable recording in OBS. So quality is the way to go. It lowers the GPU headroom that recording uses, and the visual quality difference is minimal, if not negligible. You can go lower, obviously, but once you start going lower, you start degrading visual quality, which can be bad, and you might get a performance boost, but it's not going to be as appreciable as the difference between max quality and quality. Profile. This basically defines the compatibility of the file with given resolutions. So baseline might only be compatible with resolutions up to like 720p or even 480p, whereas main and high will work with 1080p and then 4K for high. It also goes higher than that, obviously. High has support for very high resolutions. Use high, that's what most platforms online expect, and it's what's going to work best in editors, and it won't limit your resolution to a specific value. Now, look ahead is something that I kind of have to explain B-frames, but to understand B-frames, you have to understand how H.264 actually is encoded. Basically, H.264 is a compressed file format that takes the frame data from the previous frame to draw the next frame. So for every current frame, the encoder has looked at the previous frame and said, okay, these 25 pixels have changed between the old frame and the new frame. Throw away all the other pixels that didn't change and just change the 25 that did change for the new frame. And it does this for every frame, and basically throwing away all that data that doesn't change compresses the file down really small. And there is a much more complicated and nuanced answer, and I'm glossing over and generalizing a lot of things, but that is kind of it in a nutshell. B-frames are bidirectional frames, which means they're individual frames that contain data from the previous frame and the next frame to composite the current frame together. And while they can yield better file sizes, better visual quality, stuff like that, they're a little bit slower to decode. But more than that, enabling look ahead means you need more GPU resources to record the same file with. So you're not really getting a huge benefit. B-frames do tend to slow down video editing applications because when you scrub, your computer has to look at like 3 frames every time it hits a B-frame, which is bad. It's not a huge impact, but it can be noticeable. And by and large, there is no benefit to using B-frames in recordings with OBS. Like I said, it's marginal, the improvement you get visually, and you can certainly enable B-frames using the max B-frame setting, which is at the bottom here. But you really don't need to. I don't use B-frames and my files edit just fine. Everything looks great. As far as psycho-visual tuning goes, it's kind of a question mark. Like, I'm sure someone in the comments will be able to explain it better than I can. But basically, psycho-visual tuning is a flag that the developers of OBS found improves visual quality for demanding visually complex recordings like gameplay stuff. And it's going to be negligible in terms of the visual difference you get when you're recording with CQ levels that are appropriate, like what I'm recommending you do. And again, it uses GPU resources. So it could be the difference between getting a stable recording and not getting one. And in return, you're getting basically no real visual quality difference. So I just leave it disabled. GPU, if you have multiple GPUs in your system, you need to set OBS to use the GPU the game's rendering on, because otherwise you're just inflating the performance cost of using OBS. And some people say it'll offset the cost. Some people will say it doesn't. The recommendation is always use the GPU that the game is rendering on, because that's like the most direct route from getting the frame data from the GPU to the video encoder. It's the fastest and most efficient way to do it, and it's my recommendation. And then finally, max B-frames. Like I said, you can enable B-frames. You have to look up the value for your given frame rate. It's tied specifically to frame rate. but you set it to 0 and you're not going to really notice a difference. Now, there is one other set of settings you need to pay attention to in OBS in terms of recording settings, and that is the video advanced settings. Color format, color space, and color range all play pretty big roles in the actual fidelity of your file and a bunch of other things. Color format, you want to use NV12 because it's the fastest, it's the least intense to encode, and it also gives you perfectly acceptable quality. Like, unless you're doing extreme color correction, like really tweaking the colors and exposure and all that stuff of your video files and editing, you do not need anything more than NV12. If you need pixel perfect, like one-to-one representation of what you see on screen in your recording, then yeah, use RGB. But if you need that, then chances are you already know how to get that, and you can set your settings appropriately. For everyone else, including me who makes this content professionally, NV12 is perfectly fine. Color space, 709, again, is what you should be using. 601 is a lower spec standard. It's a little bit older as far as I know. And 709 is what you should be using. Color range, partial versus full. This is a big problem. A lot of applications don't properly read the color range flag of full in OBS files. And it's not specific to OBS necessarily, but I've seen this problem in Premiere, Chrome, Firefox, Edge. They all render this flag differently. They all look at it and go, oh, it should be full, or I should compress it to partial. Full does yield, in some ways, better quality. And if you can find a workflow where you consistently get from full in your recording to full in your publishing destination, like YouTube, whatever, then by all means use full. But chances are you're going to stumble along the way, and there's going to be some weird color conversion that happens, and it's going to look bad. So use partial. For web content, it's like more than acceptable. The only time you really need to worry about full is if you're like archiving stuff and you want to preserve as much color range data as possible. But if again, like with the color format stuff, if you need to do that, you already know how to you know what you need to do. Okay, I shouldn't have to explain it to you. But if you do need an explanation, the answer is figure out the workflow that preserves the color as you see it in the OBS preview to your destination, and you're good to go. Otherwise, just use partial, because that's going to be compatible with like everything. Now, outside of OBS, there are two things you need to keep in mind. The first thing is game mode. In previous versions of Windows, game mode was kind of a huge point of contention. And that was because Microsoft didn't think to whitelist applications like OBS, which are typically run while games are running. What game mode does is it says, I'm prioritizing the game, everything else gets a lower priority in the system, you get lower GPU resource utilization stuff. Like it basically says the game gets everything it needs to run as best it can. People like to think that game mode is like this evil setting that manipulates the computer and makes games run poorly. It makes your games run better. It's not a huge difference for most people. It'll be marginal at best for most people, but it does make some difference. And enabling it will ensure that your game is getting as much attention as it needs to run as best it can. In the most recent versions of Windows 10, Microsoft whitelisted OBS so it doesn't get impacted by game mode. And this is great because it means the game is getting is able to render as many frames per second as possible, and there's nothing else going on to distract from that. And that includes OBS, which is also getting all of the GPU resources it needs to run properly because it's whitelisted. On top of that, however, you can also whitelist the OBS exe file by going to properties and compatibility for the OBS 64-bit.exe file. And basically, when you run the program as administrator in the most recent update of OBS, it whitelists OBS to use GPU resources that are being requested by other applications like your game. The downside is you might lose a few FPS, and I mean like a few, like 5 to 10 FPS in your game, but you'll gain a rock solid recording in OBS. Your frame rate shouldn't fluctuate once you enable this, because the game will just go lower and lower in frame rate until OBS is working properly. That said, like if you're running into a situation where you're like 95% utilization, 100% utilization all the time before you even open OBS, setting this to run as administrator isn't going to make a dramatic difference. The thing that will make the most difference is capping your frame rate, obviously, in game manually. But this setting can help in that, like, all right, everything's running at like 90% utilization. It's fine. I'm going to open OBS and start recording. And then, you throw a grenade in a game and the utilization goes up to 95%. OBS won't have a conflict getting the 10% it needs. It'll just say, no, game, you don't get that extra 5%. I get it, and you can piss off. So yeah, your frame rate at that exact moment might drop a couple frames, but OBS will stay rock solid, and that's what you want. Whew. This is a long video, and I want to thank you guys for sticking through to the end, because I feel like if you have, now you understand OBS to some degree. You know, this is a very complicated application. It's got a lot of moving parts, and it can be very hard to wrap your head around. Hopefully I helped you. If I did, leave a comment letting me know what I helped you with. And also tell me what you think I could improve about this video. I want to make these kinds of videos in the future where I sit down and I just talk about stuff and I give you my opinion, insight, and expertise. And I don't want to script it out and make it a super complicated video for me to produce. This video has taken me months, and I've literally just been re-recording the same thing over and over again. So let me know your feedback in the comments. But of course, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for future content. Thank you for watching.